Welcome to workshop. Our supporters and friends, Ken and Agnes Young, have had a long time interest in art and crafts of China, including the very long 2,000-year history of silk embroidery. In 2010, they invited me to go with them to China to visit one of the centers of silk embroidery. That visit to the Silk Embroidery Center led to a proposition by the Youngs that we mount an exhibition of some of the traditional works that they had been collecting over several years. And so there are 7 of the traditional works that most of you have seen in the far corner from their collection. And we thought, well, wouldn't it be interesting to invite several Toronto artists, architects, designers to make propositions, critiques of that tradition, but to open sort of new ideas about how this long tradition of silk embroidery might transform and advance. So tonight we have this opportunity to have a discussion amongst the participants, moderated by Andy Payne. Andy's a professor at the Daniels Faculty of Architecture, Landscape and Design at the University of Toronto, and kindly agreed to be our moderator.
My piece actually is kind of a fusing of craft in the traditional sense of, like, you know, stitching stuff together, and the modern world of microelectronics and you know, technology on that sort. And I think also Hacklab and places like it, which are like community maker spaces, community technology spaces, are again a kind of a fusing of the idea of technological civilization with the craft mentality, the idea that we can make things by hand. So part of what we do at Hacklab is we teach people how to take technology into their own hands, how to develop their own technologies. And that involves things like, you know, learning how to order parts, learning how to make circuit schematics, learning how to solder, learning how to put things together. So, I mean, I certainly think that there's kind of a revival of the idea of craft in the technological world right now. And my piece is an example.
Craft becomes it almost needs to be defined further in a way to really figure out what the role of craft is in contemporary society. So, I mean, when I think of craft, I mean, you could consider that when Steve Jobs and Wozniak in their backyard garage put the first Apple computer together, it was a sense of craft, right? Then there's the notion of the embroidery, right? Maybe that's more in the category of the arts and crafts. Now, the revival of the notion of making is also important. I think there's this unbelievable sort of resurgence in which the mode of production is really taken to another level. I think, let's say around a decade ago, we were completely sort of involved by the cliche of the knowledge society, right, where the notion of making was basically being exported to the East, and we would preoccupy ourselves with the production of knowledge. Hence, that notion is perhaps not completely what it has come to be now, and actually this revival of craft that Eric actually sort of started to talk about is a really interesting phenomena in which actually now we're in a condition where we not only produce knowledge, but it's a kind of very intricate condition where the production of knowledge is now associated with a high level of empowerment in the mode of production and making.
I mean, maybe to follow up on that, the notion of craft for us, let's say, in working with the Blanky, is really a return to or thinking of craft as the art of the artisan, the kind of the artisan and their familiarity with the material and the testing of the limits of materials. So I think today we're bombarded with a plethora of new materials, And in a way, it's up to us to begin to test those limits, to experiment with them, find out what they can and cannot do, and to carry that idea of a very intimate relationship with materials, let's say that was familiar to pre-industrial cultures. For example, with embroidery, taking a blank piece of material and then through stitching, you know, a layering of incredibly intricate stitching, beginning to animate that piece of fabric. With the blanket, it became, well, how can we begin to animate this piece of fabric given today's technologies? And hence, when one starts to think about microelectronics, the embedding of sensors and microcontrollers in everyday objects, that became a sort of a central theme.
There are many ways to look at Suzhou embroidery, but surely one of the characteristic features is as a dramatization of the tension between the technique and the form and the figure. It's the thrill of seeing the figure emerge from
the repetition of the technical.
Exactly. And every craft object is involved with that, but actually the embroidery really exacerbates and dramatizes this tension. And I think this is what we were aiming for, basically the subjection or subjugation of electronic circuitry to ornamental figure. But it's not like it's a purely gratuitous imposition, and this is what's, again, that's what's interesting for us about this tradition, is that it's hard to know where the utility begins and where the ornament ends.
A question that I have when kind of confronting the notion of craft in the digital era is the relationship of the hand to craft, and does the idea of craft depend on the hand? I think that there is a common association of the two things, handedness and craft. But in our work, although we use the hand, you know, in our design, in our first conceptual phase, and also in the phase of actual assembly, there are many stages in the fabrication that are completely removed from the hand, 2 levels removed. So working digitally on screen and then sending to print digitally in the laser cutter. And I think that it's important to maybe remove that sense that the crafted part is the handed part. Because if we think about, you know, what is the virtue of the craftsperson, and one of those virtues, I guess, in maybe a Ruskinian sense, is that the craftsperson inflects the type, the acanthus leaf, or whatever it is, with their own imprint, their own personality, and so it's humanized. And that you never get the same thing all over again. And it's tempting to maybe look at our work and see a lexicon of parts and assume that they're all the same, and that because they're digitally fabricated, they're all the same. But I can tell you, of having worked with this material quite closely, it's never the same, and one piece can be designed precisely the same as the other and cut with the exact same specifications and won't fit or will behave slightly differently. So the material itself kind of pushes back on that notion of creating a platonically replicated part. So I think that, you know, the materiality is still there, and the handedness or the craftedness is still there in every process, regardless of an actual hand is used.
Just echoing what Jonathan has said, I think you've given us at least a pair or 3 of exquisitely framed traps, and it's sort of a deliciously complex little series of questions that you've given us. First of all, to contrast industry to the hand. And so we're launched into a 200-year-old debate, which has been a tremendously anxious one for generation upon generation immediately past. And then to ramp up that anxiety by the cultural sense of us borrowing from a profoundly different people, values, iconography, industry, family structure. I want to resist both of those traps. If the hand versus industry, and if cultural otherness versus my own ethnicity are at work here. And perhaps that becomes possible first through a sense of saturation and absolute involvement in the different layers of making. And it's very tempting to say that when we look at those miraculously beautiful works that have launched this thing, that are here at the back of the room, it's rather tempting to say that each thread piles on the next and then floats in that gauze through a material and practical necessity of achieving a sensitivity and a nuance, and that the technologies, what it takes in order to gain that expression, are what is used. And if I look at the work that way, then the means of craft versus machine becomes somewhat irrelevant. I mean, the issue is the substance, the nuance, the trace, the evocation that work renders.
The decision to do the gold threads to represent Yonge Street was really, again, a translation of what that street means to the city. And I think that we've spent a lot of time in the city doing various recordings of architecture, of street signs, over the last 4 years. In fact, we've done a lot of work, including a lot of work along Yonge Street, which is, goes from points very rough architecturally to being, it's almost never refined, but it has its moments. But it's an idea, and I think that one of the things that we want in probably all of our work is that interpretation, that the way in which we can if you're talking about translation, we can translate an idea into something that's physical. It's a tiny little mirror of what Yonge Street might think of itself, and I think that's that way of representing itself was part of that translation. And we found a wonderful company who embroidered baseball caps. And they didn't modify their software, but they modified their operator. As I think the story is that they brought in somebody from outside who, because normally you would only need a few colors to do a Blue Jays hat, and we wanted more colors, and so they brought in somebody who could treat the digital image in a way for their machine.
I think it's interesting that there's magnifying glasses with the traditional embroidery as well, because it's kind of like you can't really see it with the naked eye. So it's visible, but it's also hidden. So you have to take a magnifying glass and look at how those embroideries are made, or try to understand how they're made. And I think in a conceptual way, you need to do that with our piece, the Street of Heaven piece. You can't really know how it's made by looking at it. You have to understand a process that we engaged in.
For us, conceptually, that the idea of the moraine as something which is incredibly slow, changing over time, which is laid down or kind of moving incrementally, we found to be very consistent with the way the code was structured to actually lay down the threads. So on one hand, we had these very precise numerical constraints, which were, for example, we started discussing this with the embroiderer, said how many stitches can we make for this amount of money in this amount of time, and we wanted 1 million because we thought 1 million is just a great number. We'll start there. And they said, well, we can do 1 million, but 750,000 would be better. The funny thing is with the way the software is written, it's written to optimize precisely this problem in industry. industry, which is to get the job done in a certain amount of time, it can ask to be within a certain stitch count. And there are algorithms written into it to actually achieve that as quickly as possible.
With digital tools, like one area that to be explored are areas of let's say mass customization. This is a very popular term that we use both in practice and in academia. And I do think that there's comments about then how we can inflect upon these tools to create new artifacts is the bigger question, because I have to say when we were handed the initial images of these embroidery pieces, it's overwhelming when one kind of understands the skilled hand that was involved in making it. So when we addressed this, I'd say that we had no interest in craft initially, and/or competing with this notion of specialization. In fact, so what we're proposing, in fact, has much more to do with questioning pictorial representation as a temporal construct. And so what part of our challenge was in terms of reconstituting, it's like the novelty of this proposition is that these don't exist three-dimensionally. So in fact, what we had to do was take thousands of individual views of an object and in essence, re-extract points from those views that then we generated a point cloud, a digital point cloud, the density of which, when I hear numbers like 1 million threads, that we ended up with text files, so just words in a text file that were larger than a gigabyte in size. And the complexity of kind of working with that information and reconciling it for the 3D print was certainly a challenge, but it was the curiosity of the reconciliation of something that doesn't exist in 3 dimensions, which was then followed to our interest in, there's a hologram, which is the piece that ties this play between the 2-dimensional construct and the 3-dimensional construct that we had, and ties it back into a cleaner narrative as it relates to the embroidery.